The lawn in front of the White House hummed. It was a toasty spring afternoon in Washington, D.C., and families, reporters, and tourists were on the South Lawn for a special community outreach event hosted by the White House Communications Office. The event, Voices from the Heartland, was designed to create a space in which government officials could engage with real people, particularly children and families visiting the nation's capital. Among those who spoke briefly and greeted attendees afterward was Karolyn Leavitt, the youngest press secretary in United States history. Today, unlike her usual press briefings, was not about fielding questions from reporters. It was about listening. Listening to stories, listening to people. She climbed onto a small outdoor stage under pink flowering trees, her navy blue blazer crisp in the sun, prepared to connect, not as a political mouthpiece, but as someone who had once been a child, small with big questions herself. Kids congregated up front, waving tiny American flags distributed by volunteers, the scent of popcorn and fresh-cut grass combined. Security was more relaxed, but the tone was softer, designed for families and storytelling, not politics. One of those faces belonged to 7-year-old Grace, a soft-spoken girl from Virginia. She was wearing a pale yellow sundress, her curly brown hair drawn back with a white ribbon. In her hands she bore a crayon-colored drawing, a heart in the American flag. Her grandmother had taken her, telling her they might see someone very important. As Karoline stepped on stage, she smiled, waved for a moment, then looked across the front row and locked eyes with Grace. It was something about the little girl's stillness, about the way she hugged her drawing to her chest, that drew Karoline's gaze like a magnet. Grace wasn't there to cheer. She had come with a question, one that would paralyze everything. Grace's grandmother gave her a gentle nudge. "You said you wanted to ask her something, honey. This might be your chance." Grace's fingers quivered slightly over her drawing. She glanced up at her grandmother with wide, nervous eyes, and then back at the woman on stage, the woman she'd seen on TV standing next to the president. Karoline saw the girl hesitate. She stepped off the platform without a hesitation of her own. The crowd parted slightly as she approached Grace and squatted down to meet her at eye level. "Hey there," she said quietly, her voice warm, steady. "Is that drawing for me?" Grace nodded and handed her the picture, wordlessly. Karoline smiled and began to gently unfold the paper marked with crayon. "It's beautiful," she said under her breath, as her eyes moved across the heart encased in a flag. "Did you do all of this yourself?" Grace gave a tiny nod. Karoline's tone stayed kind, inquisitive. "Do you want to tell me what it means?" Grace hesitated. Her lower lip quivered. Then she gazed upward into Karoline's eyes and asked, in a voice as frail and errant as the breeze, "Do you think God still loves me? Even my daddy left?" The moment froze. The air seemed to still. Even the murmur of the wind rustling in the trees withered, as if that very nature paused to observe. Karoline blinked, taken aback by the rawness of Grace's question. Her throat tightened. She had fielded innumerable questions in press briefings and interviews, but not like this. None that unlocked something personal, something buried. She looked quickly at Grace's grandmother standing a few steps behind her, hands pressed together over her chest, eyes glistening. The older woman, faintly encouraging, nodded. Karoline had turned back to the girl and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice soft, "you do not know how brave you are for asking that." Grace's lip quivered, and she glanced down at the drawing in Karoline's hands. "I want you to know something," Karoline said. "When I was a little older than you, my dad left too." Gasps rippled through the small crowd of people standing nearby. Karoline had never publicly discussed this before, not on camera, not even in interviews. "I used to wonder that question," she said, her voice firm but heavy with emotion. "I would ask God if he forgot about me, if I'd done something wrong." Grace looked up. Her eyes were wide with quiet pain. Karoline smiled softly past the lump in her throat. "But the answer I've understood in my heart has been this. Yes, Grace, God still loves you, especially you." Grace blinked, her eyes mirroring Karoline's face for truth, not the sort spoken from podiums, but the sort murmured in the dark when no one is listening. Karoline held the drawing in Grace's hand again, flattening the wrinkled edges. "You made this?" Grace gave a tiny nod. "It's beautiful," Karoline said quietly. You smiled at the sun even. I believe that's exactly how God sees you." Around them, the crowd that had respectfully grown silent froze. No cell phones were raised, no aides interrupted. It felt like the world knew to leave this moment alone. Karoline went on. "When my dad left, I thought I needed to be tough. I thought maybe people wouldn't get it if I cried or referenced God." She let out a breath. "But I've learned something. God is not far away. He's right here with us, especially when we hurt." Grace's lips parted slightly. "Even when I'm angry?" Karoline smiled. Even then, another tear slid down Grace's cheek, but she didn't glance away. Do you think he can still hear me if I talk to him?" Karoline leaned in so their foreheads almost touched. "Yes, Grace. He's been listening all that time." And for the first time, Grace smiled. Small, unsure, but real. Lowering her face, Karoline whispered and wiped a damp strand of hair from Grace's forehead. A few seconds later, Grace's tiny smile remained. "Can I tell you a secret?" Karoline whispered. The girl nodded, eyes wide. "I pray to God all the time," Karoline said, "not in speeches or meetings, just when I'm by myself, when I'm worried, or when I'm thankful, or when I don't know what to do." Grace looked surprised. "Even now? And when you're really busy?" Karoline chuckled softly. "Especially now. Busy teaches me how much I need him even more." The drizzle had stopped. A gentle breeze ruffled the flags behind them, and a man in the crowd dropped to his knees to get closer to the scene playing out. Grace's grandmother stepped back, hands clutching her heart, speechless. Karoline took a slow breath. "You ask me whether God loves kids whose daddy's up and left. The answer is yes, 100 times yes. And do you know what else?" Grace leaned in. "He doesn't love you. He loves you. He chose you. He sees how brave you are, how kind you are, how much you still hope, even when it's hard." Grace blinked back tears, though they weren't the same as before. Then she leaned in and whispered, "Do you think maybe he sent you?" Karoline's eyes shimmered. "Maybe he sent both of us. Right here, right now." Grace sat quietly for a moment, clinging to Karoline's hand, like it was the only stable thing about the world. The storm in her had silenced. Not entirely, but enough to allow hope to show itself. The question still sat between them, but now it had been put into something gentler to wear, something like faith. Karoline leaned back a bit, her knees wet from kneeling on the sidewalk, but she didn't seem to care. "Can I show you something?" she said, dipping into her coat pocket. Grace nodded. Karoline took a small, folded piece of paper. It was worn, edges soft, like it had been opened 100 times. "I've saved this since I was your age," she said, delicately unfolding it. It was a Bible verse in faded ink. Grace tilted her head to read it. "I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you." John 14:18. "That's what I focused on," Karoline said. "Every time I felt overlooked or afraid or insignificant." Grace reread it, silently mouthing the words. "You're not an orphan," Karoline said, her voice strained with the emotion. "But even when people go, God doesn't." From somewhere in the crowd emerged a quiet, "Amen." Another person wept softly. Grace said, "Can I take it home?" Karoline smiled as she handed her the paper. "It's already yours." The paper seemed more than words to Grace. It seemed a promise. She enveloped it with tiny fingers, clutching it to her chest as if it could stuff the hole her father has left. Karoline stayed next to her, the press secretary's poise long lost, instead flooded with something more elemental: presence. The event, behind them, had gone still. Staffers stood, radios crying, White House staffers white-tipped among themselves. No one interrupted. No one moved. They all witnessed this improbable moment between national figure and tearful child, and they knew they were witnessing something rare, something real. Karoline brushed a raindrop off Grace's cheek, unsure whether it was born of the sky or her tear. "You want to know if God can love kids who have dads who walked away," she said gently, "and I need you to remember this for the rest of your life. God doesn't leave. He leans in." Grace nodded slowly, her lips quivering. Karoline pressed on, "And sometimes he sends people only to remind us. Grace looked up again. Like you? Karoline's eyes welled. Maybe, she whispered, but also like you. Your question. That reminded all of us that faith begins in wonder, with being courageous enough to ask. I realized she's not only talking to that girl, she's talking to all of us, someone in the crowd whispered. The quiet among the lawn was not silence, but reverence. Not for politics or position, but for the sanctity of what had just happened. Grace stood next to Karoline, eyes wide, no longer tearful but lit with something new. Understanding. No one had dismissed the weight of her question. This one critically and commercially. Karoline rose slowly to her feet, still holding Grace's hand. Karoline stayed next to her, the press secretary's poise long lost, instead flooded with something more elemental. Presence. I've given press briefings in front of cameras, she said, her tone both steady and warm. But none of that ever meant more to me than what just happened here. Grace rested her head on Karoline's side. There's not a lot we agree on, Karoline added. But sometimes we forget that the most important questions are those that we can't work up the courage to ask out loud. She passed around Grace's card for the group to see, the one with the flag and the smiling sun, and the words on the back that still lingered. God, do you still love me? The crowd hushed. And the answer is yes, Karoline said, flashing Grace a gentle smile. Always yes. Grace didn't say anything, nor did she need to. Karoline's hand remained tightly bound in hers as she and Karoline stood before the quiet crowd. The card fluttered softly in the light breeze, and for an instant it seemed like the entire crowd was breathing with them. Soft, slow, steady. Karoline knelt again, bringing her eyes to a level with Grace. Do you know what I think, Grace? She asked gently. The little girl blinked back curiously. I think sometimes God speaks the loudest through the littlest voices. A few people nodded quietly. A mother in the back wiped away tears. Even a seasoned journalist dropped his camera for the first time that day, as if to avoid intruding on something too tender to be captured by a lens. A lot of the times, Karoline continued, we seek out answers in bombastic speeches or lofty tomes, but the most important reminders come from a child who asks the simple question, Am I still loved? Grace glanced down at the card and then back up at Karoline. I feel it now, she said quietly. Karoline smiled. That's because it's true. And you didn't just ask a question, Grace. You did help remind a whole crowd of grown-ups that the answer still matters. The press secretary wiped her eyes, and so did half the crowd. The moment lingered. The staffers who had been darting around the crowd, clutching press schedules, were now immobilized, watching something far more important than what makes the headlines. Grace rested her head against Karoline's shoulder, finally calm. One man in a dark suit, someone from the press team, I would guess, stepped forward, as if trying to move things along. But Karoline raised a hand, just a little. Not now. Not yet. I want to tell you something that I don't often say in public, Karoline said, her voice tender but steady. It was like my voice didn't matter, like nobody was really listening. She scanned the crowd slowly. But someone was. Grace tilted her head. Karoline smiled gently. God was. Even when I questioned him, even when I yelled at him, he was still listening. And he's listening to you too. A soft gasp from a woman near the front. One man removed his cap with one hand and brought it to his chest with the other. But what if I don't know how to talk to him? Grace whispered. Karoline leaned over for the small card, ran her fingertip across the corner of it. You already did, sweetheart. That drawing, that question, that was your prayer. And God, she was sure, had heard it clear as day. Grace was quiet, hands folded over the edges of her drawing. The question, written in uneven strokes of crayon, still stared up at her. God, do you still love me? Karoline gingerly took the card, raising it above her head so everyone on the lawn could see. This question, she continued, her voice ringing without a microphone, is the kind of courage we forget exists. Then she crouched lower, handing the drawing back to Grace. You said what millions of people are terrified to say out loud. And you did it with color, with honesty, with heart. Grace blinked. and for the first time she appeared proud, not merely emotional, but courageous. "I need you to do something for me," Karoline said. "Tonight before you go to sleep, I want you to talk to him again, just like you did today. Say something, anything, even just hi." Grace nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. "And if anyone here has had a question on your heart for a while," she added gently, "now's the time to ask it." A hush settled once more, a shared, sacred silence. Grace snuggled next to Karoline on the bench, squeezed the crayon drawing tightly as if it might take flight. The press secretary reached over and tucked a tendril of Grace's hair behind her ear, then turned to the assembled crowd, quiescent, reverential. "I didn't expect this today," Karoline said frankly, her voice a steady whisper. "I came here to listen, to stories, to questions, but Grace reminded me that listening is not always quiet. Sometimes it means listening to the pain, and sometimes, it means kneeling." She hesitated and smiled at the little girl next to her. "And I'm honored that I got to kneel next to you today." A teen wiped his eyes and said, "She's braver than I'll ever be." Karoline looked back at Grace. "Want to know something?" she asked. Grace nodded. "When I was your age, I was scared as well. Till then, I didn't know things happened for a reason. But I was told once that God doesn't wait for us to be perfect. He loves us where we're at, just like this." Grace looked up, and for the first time that day she spoke calmly. "Even if we're small?" Karoline leaned in close. "Especially then." Grace's fingers gradually relaxed their hold on the drawing. Her shoulders were no longer shaking. She leaned softly against Karoline's side. The crowd was silent, not out of obligation, but because something within them compelled it. This time it wasn't a press event or political moment. It was sacred. Karoline looked up, her tone even but friendly. "I want you all to know something," she said, looking around at the onlookers who now seemed to be holding their breath. Grace didn't simply ask a question today. She asked the question, the one every child wonders, the one every adult hides. She held the drawing up, Grace's childlike lettering still faintly showing under the raindrop stains that had soaked it earlier. "God, do you still love me?" Karoline read aloud. "That is not a childish question. That's a question that can topple kingdoms and bring hope from rubble." The girl next to her stared up in wonder. "Grace," Karoline said, turning to her, "when you asked that, you reminded everyone here that faith doesn't need to be loud. Sometimes, the good noise is made by the quietest voices that shake the earth." A droplet dripped off the little girl's cheek, but this time, it wasn't from sadness. It was from being seen, heard, believed. And somewhere in the audience, someone began whispering, "She's already changing lives." Karoline lowered the drawing and redirected her focus to Grace, who was seated with wet hair behind her ears, wide-eyed, still searching for something that words could never quite name. "You know," Karoline replied softly, "I didn't always feel so strong that I could respond to questions like yours." Grace tilted her head. "You didn't?" Karoline smiled. "No. When I initially started breaking the ice in front of big crowds, I felt like I needed to have all the answers. I thought I was supposed to be flawless. But then I started thinking, real strength isn't in having the answers. It's about continuing to have the courage to keep asking the questions." The little girl nodded, her brow furrowed. "Actually," Karoline added, "one of the most courageous things you will ever do is what you did today. To ask someone, 'What do you say about God?' when your heart is thumping with heaviness." Grace hesitated, and then, as if buoyed by something larger than herself, she asked, "Can I ask him one more thing?" Karoline leaned forward and took her hand. "Of course." Grace also closed her eyes and intoned, "God, if you're real, can you help me feel like I matter?" A hush fell again, and Karoline, tears glimmering in her eyes, said back, "You already do, Grace, more than you'll ever know." The wind took Grace's whispered prayer into the soft spring air over the south lawn, where cherry blossoms still fluttered lightly in the breeze. The cameras weren't trained on her anymore. They were focused on a child, on Grace, whose one question had shaken the hearts of generations. Grandparents wept quietly. Teens put down their phones. Parents pulled their children tighter. For just one long moment, this crowd wasn't divided along party lines or opinions. They were something greater. Karoline pulled Grace into a standing position. "You matter," she repeated softly, "and I hope you never forget that." Grace smiled now, a real, stable smile, the kind that harbors hope in its corners. From the audience, a pastor walked up slowly, voice shaking. "Miss Leavitt, I've preached every Sunday for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like what I saw here today." Karoline rested a hand on Grace's shoulder. "Neither have I." It would be a viral moment that evening. Headlines would read, "Child's naive question reduces White House press secretary to tears." But for Karolyn Leavitt, viral was not the point. It was about Grace, and the God who had answered her, through a whisper in the wind.